bottom line.
Good day and welcome to the Payments Podcast. I'm Jacqueline Powell and I'll be your host for today's episode, focusing on how accounts payable departments can and should tighten their vendor setup and maintenance processes. Now, despite best efforts, trends change, technology advances, staff are now working remotely, and fraudsters are just getting smarter every day. So it's unsurprising that loopholes in the vendor onboarding process will continue to emerge, leaving finance departments and their companies at risk. To provide insight into this topic, we have an industry professional with extensive experience in the procure to pay lifecycle, covering AP, AR, general ledger, and finance reporting for several Fortune 500 companies across many different sectors. That guest is Debra R Richardson, a highly regarded accounts payable speaker, trainer, and consultant. So for the past 12 years, Debra has focused on global vendor maintenance across the US, APAC, EMEA, and LATAM countries, implementing a self-registration portal across several different ERPs. She's also a certified fraud examiner, helping both private and public sector organizations to keep their vendor master file free from internal and external fraud. Debra, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So, Debra, I guess it's fair to say many people just fall into the world of AP early on in their careers. Given that there is no specific AP qualification, it leaves many teams, I would imagine, without any formal framework or best practice rules within which to operate. Given your extensive experience working with AP departments, where do you see the biggest gaps, the flaws, or perhaps even challenges in the AP process?
Yeah, so I see it most often really in the vendor setup and maintenance process. There's really a lack of training in areas that could help to avoid that fraud, avoid the fines, avoid bad vendor data, and really more training in authentication techniques, best practices, internal controls, vendor validations, not only in the larger AP space, but also really focusing on vendor setup and maintenance, really that foundation of vendor setup, right? Compliance, maintaining valid data, avoiding fraud, really needs to be customized for AP and the vendor team. Because if you think about it, right, the typical cybersecurity awareness training of not opening attachments or clicking links from senders you don't know, or emails you weren't expecting, and that's all we get in AP in the vendor team, because a lot of times we don't have the relationships with these vendors. We just get an invoice that shows up, or we get vendor supporting documentation, right, that we have to process. So we need better training in those areas, especially for fraud. And then tools too, right? There's a lack of tools in these areas. We need tools for fraud prevention, right? Because we know that there was a report out that came, or report that came out last year that said IT can spot about 85% or so of fraudulent emails. But that means that 15% are coming through. So what do we do with those? Right? And they're getting smarter too with those emails that are coming through. They're sounding more legitimate. And then also, AP still has a lot of manual processes. There are reports out now about how the Great Resignation, remember that last year, the year before, is now over. It's now the Great Stagnation, right? The latest generation, they're not coming into accounting or financial operations positions that have manual processes, because it's really at this point no opportunity for those advanced tools like generative AI. We're still kind of struggling on getting that. But I would also say really the problem is really in the vendor setup piece. I mean, we do have some issues with fraudulent invoices, but if you think about it, you can't pay a fraudulent invoice to a fraudster unless the vendor setup, the vendor remittance information is updated. So that's really where we have that lack of training, lack of tools is really felt in that area.
Touching on manual processes, which you've just spoken about, I would imagine that is a major challenge for AP departments. Generally, though, with so much being digitized these days, is that really still happening? How far have companies come, or how far away are they from achieving full AP automation?
So there are still many companies. I don't have like a percentage, but there are many companies, AP teams, vendor teams that I meet when I go to conferences. And yes, they are still receiving invoices, and more so than invoices, vendor documents for vendor setup via risky email. And that's just still a reality for so many accounts payable and vendor teams. And those that still have, or those that do have portals, there are still some issues with the portals, but that is moving in the right direction, because really finding a way to remove the collection of invoices and vendor documents, and those vendor documents can have sensitive data on it, right? Trying to find, or finding a way to remove that from email really removes a lot of the risk of payment fraud. And it's just hard for the AP staff to be 100% all day, every day, to detect emails that are fraudulent, right? And the fraudsters are getting much better at sending those emails to make them sound very legitimate. So it's just really getting very hard. Um, and then again, with that manual vendor setup, right? You've got input errors. You have to have processes in place that can catch and audit, because there's really a requirement for consistency in performing those authentication techniques, best practices, internal controls, vendor validations, to make sure it's always being done. Because sometimes, we get busy in AP, month in, year in, and sometimes all those things we put into place, they take more time, and you have to have a way to make sure, especially in that manual vendor setup process, that it's consistently being done. And then we've got, segregation of duties, which is very important when you have manual processes. But I still see some things that are being done that I would not recommend being done. So I know one big thing for avoiding fraud is that confirmation call, which has its own problems. But some companies will place that task with a different department, citing segregation of duties. But what I see is that now you have a whole different department that had no reason to have exposure to sensitive vendor data, meaning banking details, and now they have access to banking details because they have to confirm it. They have to verify what's already on the existing, or what's already existing on the vendor record. They have to get the new banking. And so now you have access to sensitive data to someone that absolutely didn't have to have it, except for the fact that they're doing that confirmation call. So we have that issue. And then lastly, there's just manual check payments and the associated fraud with that. I know we here in the US, we still have a lot of check payments, but you really have, exposure to internal and external fraud. And with internal fraud, there is a an internal control that should be present, where you are physically locking those checks up, restricting access, but that's not always happening. And someone can just, walk by the reception desk where all those checks are, piled up, waiting for somebody to take them to the post office or waiting for the mail carrier, and they could just walk off with it. And that happens all the time. And then external fraud, talking about walking off with checks. Fraudsters they are now stealing checks from those blue boxes. And if you ever want to just be a little terrified, you can go to the U.S. Inspection Service website. It's part of USPS, United States Postal Service. And you can see the wanted posters from these fraudsters stealing the mailbox keys directly from the carriers so that they can get a hold of the checks that you might have put in those blue boxes. So, don't put them in the blue boxes, take them to the post office and deposit them in the receptacles there because, the internal fraudsters are stealing checks and so are external fraudsters. So it's just getting to the point where these manual processes, check payments are really just very exposed to fraud, and really that is something that is just plaguing the accounts payable and the vendor team at this point.
Now, in your opinion, where in the AP process do we need to actually catch fraud? You've just mentioned about that. Is it once you've approved the invoice and is ready to pay, or do the checks and balances need to happen a little bit further up in the chain?
Really, it boils down to the fact that payment fraud is really reliant on the vendor record because that's where the remittance information is. So you can't pay via check or ACH or electronic payment unless there is a remittance address or banking on the vendor record. And how does that get there? Right, through the vendor setup and maintenance process. So you really need to control it from that function, and that's where I think the focus needs to be on to start to reduce that potential for fraud.
Great. So do you have an approach or a methodology that you use in terms of trying to help organizations with that setup and maintenance framework or that process, if you like?
I do, and it's really again focus on that vendor setup and maintenance process, and I call it authentication, validation, management, and it's really a three-step process to avoid fraud, fines, and just overall bad vendor data. And so, the first step is authentication, and that's just making sure that you are communicating with or accepting vendor supporting documentation from your actual vendor or from your internal employee if that's how you get your vendor data. And that's the same way, right? If that you were to call your bank today, they wouldn't just start talking to you about whatever you called to talk about. They would ask you 2 to 3 identifying questions to make sure you are who you say you are. And that's what we need to start doing to make sure we are receiving those vendor documents from our actual vendor, or that we're actually communicating with either phone or via email when there are inquiries that we are communicating with that actual vendor or with our actual internal employee. And then once you verify that, yes, you are communicating with who you think you are communicating with or getting those documents from that actual vendor or internal employee, now you have to take those documents and you have to validate the information on it. Because how many times, I'm sure listeners out there have gotten vendor supporting documentation from whoever, right, the point of contact at the vendor that may not know, how they are set up, for example, with the IRS. They may give you a DBA name and they're just trying to check the box to give you that W-9 or W-8, but they don't really know how to fill it out. And so you do have to do validations. You also need to do things like standardizing how you're inputting that data into your vendor master file so that you can avoid duplicates. You need to do things like checking them against watch lists so that your company is not liable for fines or penalties if you're paying vendors that are prohibited. And so those things need to be done at the vendor setup and at the validation step. Oh, and I forgot one other thing too. You need to check the addresses, banking details, right, to make sure it's really not a fraudulent request. And so all of that happens at the validation stage. But once you get that information validated, you verify it's accurate, you verify that vendor is not a fraudulent vendor. Now you input that information into your vendor master file. But it absolutely doesn't stop there, because this step, which is management, means that you have to manage that information to make sure that it stays accurate and to make sure it doesn't go stale. So here you want to do things on a consistent basis where you're inactivating vendors that your company hasn't done business with in 15, 18, 24 months, or whatever level of inactivity works for your company. And then once you inactivate those vendors, your remaining active vendors, now you go and revalidate them to make sure nothing has changed. Because a lot of times vendors won't tell you if things change, especially if it doesn't affect their payments. And so you need to do things like revalidating the IRS against IRS 10 records to make sure legal name, tax ID combinations is still valid. You need to check them again against watch lists, right? Because those lists are not static, to make sure that they haven't been subsequently added to one of the watch lists since you onboarded them or checked them last. And each vendor can, cycle through each one of these steps as they have changes as well. But yes, the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process, authentication, validation, management, is really a framework. And within those 3 steps or that framework are 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, and 16 vendor validations, all related to the vendor setup and maintenance process.
It's hugely insightful. Thank you.
Yes.
So you've touched a fair bit on the validation of vendors here, and the potential for fraud. Are there any specific frauds that you're seeing more or less of in AP?
Yes, and we've all heard of AI and how that's helping fraudsters, right? Because actually, fraudsters have more access to AI, right, than we do, than the accounts payable team and the vendor team at this point, and they've already been successful with it. I mean, we've all heard of the $35 million deep fake audio fraud where the controller thought he was talking to a leadership team member and transferred that amount. And there was another one out there. And what was really scary is with the deep fake video where 26.5 million was lost, is that originated in an email. And the finance worker was a little suspicious, but you know what offset that suspicion is they all jumped on a video call, right? But there was a deep fake video, and it wasn't just one, right? One of the team members, it was multiple, and multiple team members were able to be deep faked, and enough to the point where that 26.5 million was lost. And so, and it's not just deep fake audio and deep fake video. We know that they have access, the fraudsters do, to generative AI, where they can just write those convincing emails, again, to make them sound very legitimate. And so it's getting bad out there, and it's getting less and less obvious that these emails that are coming through are fraudulent, right? Because we used to be able to spot that extra letter in a spoofed email. And yes, that does sometimes come through, but nowadays, right, even aside from AI and all of those tools, fraudsters have been so successful with phishing emails and getting the login credentials. And yes, quite a few folks are still out there using the same username and password across multiple different platforms, including the vendors. And so now the fraudsters are in your vendor's legitimate email. And they're not just sending a request to change remittance information from their legitimate email account. They're not stopping there. They're actually going to an existing email string, a historical email string, string and sending it for that from that email string asking for a change. And that really makes it appear legitimate. And so it's just really getting bad out there. One thing I will say though, you talked about reporting, and I always follow the FBI every year. They publish an IC3 report, and so that's a report that summarizes the complaints and losses that come through their internet crime complaint center. And if we specifically look at business email compromise incidents, the number of business email compromise incidents, or the number of incidents, has decreased. Keep in mind that's what's reported. So the number of reported incidents have decreased. However, the average fraud loss has increased. So back in 2019, the average loss to a business email compromise fraud was $71,000. Now it's for 2023, it's gone up to $137,000. So it's almost double. But the scary part of that is it's not the $1 million that we hear about, right, in these press releases and we see in the news. The fraudsters are after the smaller amounts, which means everyone is a target. So no company is too small to be targeted for fraud.
For sure. And I think then on the back of that, you've probably come across many companies or AP professionals who think they've got their technology processes and people nailed when it comes to fraud prevention. But in your experience, do you think that there are any blind spots, if you like, worth calling out? So any red flags you see, or perhaps telltale signs for AP managers to watch out for?
Yeah. So first off, I think that uh, many people still think that they can spot the fraudulent email, and it's just getting harder and harder to do that. Again, some of these emails are coming from your actual vendor's email box, so it's very hard to spot that. The next thing is that confirmation call. So I don't have a particular issue with a confirmation call. I think it just needs to be surrounded with other internal controls, because what I'm seeing is that the confirmation calls are being done, but they're not being done correctly or at all. So if listeners out there are, have direct reports that are performing the confirmation call, if they're not doing it themselves, you have to make sure that you're following up and have a way to verify that they are being done. Because let's take that example of the fraudster sending a change of remittance from a vendor's email account, and they're sending it from a historical email, maybe even between the receiver of that email. And so what they're doing is they're assuming that it's legitimate because it's coming from, right, a historical email string. And so they're not following up with the confirmation call because they think it's legitimate. Or they follow up with a confirmation call to the information that's in the email. And I know we all know that's not a good thing to do. But if you have a vendor and they have a change and you're looking for contact information in your vendor master file and it's not there, and then you go and do research on that vendor to see if there's a website or something you can get it from, and the vendor does not have a web presence, what do? I will tell you what they do. They will go and use the information in the email, because depending on how much training they have had, they're just trying to check that box to get on with their day and be productive. So that's one issue that I see. And another one that I see is really relying on the bank account ownership validations. And what we're seeing now is that these fraudsters are opening bank accounts using the vendor name and the information. So if you go and do a bank account ownership validation, uh, where you're validating that your vendor name is the same as the bank account holder name, that's going to pass. They're also using the same tax ID. And if you're validating, right, that the tax ID that was used to open the bank account is the same tax ID that was submitted to you to set the vendor up, that's going to pass. And so you really just need to do more. And on top of that, I talked about the 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 vendor validations, or 17 best practices and 16 vendor validations. As you put these things into place, again, you have to make sure that the vendor teams are consistently performing those. And so you see audits in AP, but they're always kind of at the higher level when you get to the vendor process. You really need to do an audit at the vendor process level to make sure that those additional steps you're putting into place to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data is being done. And so that really lack of that vendor audit, lack of the authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and vendor validations really all contribute to both internal and external fraud.
Thank you. Um, I want to swing, if you don't mind, towards using AI in accounts payable, if I may. So, what do you think the benefits are here?
Well, I think AI and other tools can help, right, to find those things that we just can't find. So we talked about AI tools and from, let's say, third-party providers to automate the submission of invoices, right? So you can better find those invoices, as I talked about before, that are coming from a different email address than where it normally comes from, or that have different information on the invoice than what is saved in the vendor master file. And those things are not, automatically able to be seen, especially on a larger scale. And so you can find those red flags by using those types of tools. But I think also, more importantly, especially for AI, is to use it at the user level, because no matter how big your company is in the vendor setup and maintenance space and AP space, really overall, there are a lot of manual processes out there. There's a lot of opportunity to use uh, uh, technology, right, generative AI, RPA, in order to automate some of the manual processes that are in the AP and vendor setup and maintenance space. And a lot of that can be at the user level. So I love the upskilling part of that. And I think we have a long way to go into getting those at the user level, but I think it can be done. And I think the time is now.
Absolutely. So, we're nearing the end of our conversation, unfortunately, but I do have one last question for you before we close out. Now, given that you're often faced with a room full of AP professionals, what would you say your biggest or possibly your most valuable advice is for them?
So I would say automate as many processes within the P2P process as you can. Start with third-party providers with the submission of invoices, with vendor onboarding and the validations, and then also with payment processing. Then, with your team, so at that user level, embrace AI, embrace RPA, and automate your manual vendor processes. That really upskills you and your team members. And so I think those are the most important takeaways.
That's great. Thank you. Before we close out, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, and unfortunately, fraudsters are evolving faster than we are. And there's going to be a time, it's not here yet, but there's going to be a time where there's going to be no way to tell that a fraudulent request has come through. So you can't rely on spotting it. If you still have a manual process, put authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and vendor validations in place to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And finally, keep fighting for the change to automate either or both with third party providers and at the user level.
That's great, Deborah. Thank you. And with that, we've come to the end of this episode. Deborah, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today. It's been really great chatting with you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome. And to our audience, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode on tightening your AP vendor setup and process. Our payments podcast episodes can be found on Apple, SoundCloud, or Spotify. Catch you next time.
The Payments Podcast from Bottom Line.